Okay, hello everyone. My name is Juan Cabello. Uh, okay, let me see. I'm gonna introduce the next speaker is Reza Rahman. And so I'm gonna introduce first in Spanish and then in English. Just very short. Reza Rahman es administrador principal de programas para Java en Azure en Microsoft. Trabaja para asegurarse que los desarrolladores Java sean ciudadanos de primera clase en Microsoft y también para que Microsoft sea un ciudadano de primera clase en el ecosistema Java. Reza ha sido tecnólogo oficial de tecnología Oracle Java por muchos años. Él es autor de un libro muy popular, JB3 in Action. También ha sido durante mucho tiempo un speaker o orador muy frecuente en grupos de usuarios de la comunidad Java en todo el mundo, incluidos el Java One y el DevOps. Ha sido líder de Java Enterprise Edition en Java One, así como también recibió el premio Java One Rockstar Speaker. Fue el presidente del programa de la conferencia inaugural Jakarta One y es un colaborador muy ávido de revistas en la industria como DSONT. Ha sido miembro de los grupos de expertos de Java, de EJB y a lo largo de todos estos años. Implementó el contenedor EJB para servidores de aplicaciones de código abierto. Ayuda a dirigir el grupo de usuarios de Java en Filadelfia y nos enorgullece en que es uno de los miembros fundadores de Jakarta EE. Muy bien. Tremenda hoja de vida. Okay, Reza, let us know if you are ready to go with your presentation. It's a pleasure to have you here in this Java conference in Peru.
Oh, no problem. I hope you guys are all doing okay. For some reason, I cannot join the comments. I apologize for that, but I am looking at the comments, so feel free to post your comments, and I'll definitely take a look there. One real quick question. This is 1 hour slot, right?
Yes.
1 hour. Yes. Okay, that's what I thought. So I think we can get rolling. Let me share my screen here and get started, and we'll go from there. All right. So I believe I am sharing my screen already, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? Are you able to see my screen? Maybe not yet. Let me try again.
Yes.
Try again. Share a screen and share it. And I hope you're able to see my screen now. Yeah.
Yes. Now it's ready.
All right. Excellent. All right. So welcome everyone. Juan already told you my name is Reza. In my day job, I'm Principal Program Manager at Java on Azure. But to be honest with you, today I'm not really presenting. In fact, today it's a Saturday for me. It's my day off, which is perfect. Because actually I'm presenting this talk not really as part of Microsoft, but to be honest, this is more of a community thing that I'm doing. It's actually a community project that I've been involved in for a little while as well. So actually, I'm presenting to you today really on behalf of the Jakarta E ambassadors, and if there's a little bit of a time, I'll let you know a little bit about what the Jakarta ambassadors are. And also on screen is my email address and Twitter account. And later on in the session, I'll actually share where this deck is. This deck is actually available publicly already on Speaker Deck. And I'll also share in my personal website my contact information. One of the reasons I do these kind of talks is to actually connect with you folks out there and basically interact with you and see what's on your mind and hopefully what we can do. So what is this talk about? This talk is actually a sort of a mashup of two different things that interest me personally quite a bit. One is domain-driven design, and we'll talk a little bit about what domain-driven design is in a moment. And it's also about Jakarta, which is my other passion. I've been involved in the Jakarta ecosystem for a very, very long time now. So this talk really is about how do you apply domain-driven design in a practical way with Jakarta being the implementation technology. The way we're looking at it is, I'm showing you that, yeah, Jakarta is actually a very good fit for domain-driven design. All right, so without further ado, there's one thing that I'd like to point out. We have about an hour together. I do intend to make use of the full hour. We definitely have a full hour of content. I'll ask you in a little bit how you would like me to drive the session. And I do expect you to let me know that. There's a couple of different ways we can drive the session. So I do need your input on that. But other than that, the other thing I want to tell you is there's no reason to hold questions until the very end. Please ask me questions throughout, right? So hopefully Juan can help keep me honest, and I'll also check in the comments to see if there's any questions posted, and then I'll answer questions throughout the session rather than at the very end. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what this talk is about, and what actually the underlying project that's called Eclipse Cargo Tracker is about. And then do be prepared. I'm going to ask you a question about how to drive the rest of this session. Okay. So a lot of you may know that you may have heard of something called a J2E blueprints or Java Pet Store. So J2E blueprints and Java Pet Store to me was a very important thing. And in fact, that is a thing that was a transition point for me personally, from just being a developer to being more of an architect in my particular field. A lot of folks these days don't remember the early days of server-side Java, but really at the very early days of server-side Java, it looked a lot like very unstructured PHP and CGI code. So there was no architecture. Every single project would apply its own architecture, or worse, have no architecture whatsoever. And really, it's the J2E blueprints or Java Pet Store that brought order to chaos. It began to define really how does server-side architectures, in particular using J2E as a technology at the time, actually looks like. So believe it or not, J2E blueprints is one of those things that has had a very significant impact on our industry. In fact, the impact is felt even today. After 20-some years, you still, for those of us who have lived sort of that time period, there's still so much impact of the J2E blueprints. In fact, many of the things that originally came out of the J2E blueprints are still alive and well today. So if you think of things like DAO or data access pattern, or proxy pattern, or even things like factory pattern applied to Java E projects, actually a lot of these things originated back in the J2E blueprints. If you go look at the J2E blueprints, that's where they were first defined. And it's just amazing that those design patterns and the work that was defined there is still living with us. But of course, J2E had its problems, and not too surprisingly, the J2E blueprints, because it was based on J2E, had its problems as well. So the biggest problems that J2E really had was that it didn't allow for rich domains to be created. It only allowed for what we now know as anemic domain models, which means that when you have data, your data objects really sort of mirror very dumb database rows. Right? They just look like, okay, here's the name of an object that reflects the name of a table, and fields that reflects database columns that are in the database table, and that's really about it. You couldn't really model behavior in any meaningful way. Generally, you're very tightly encumbered in terms of even able to use object-oriented paradigms like polymorphism and inheritance and encapsulation. So really, sort of, in a sense, where Java was supposed to be an object-oriented language, when it came down to modeling the domain and actually modeling the data, it actually defeated most of the things that you would have in an object-oriented language. So this is the observation that led eventually to something called domain-driven design, or DDD. And in fact, to be honest, the DDD concept originated more in the .NET space than the Java space. And what fundamentally domain-driven design did is that it said, okay, if we're going to design systems, those systems really should look like the real world problem that we're trying to solve. And we should be able to apply all of the principles of object-oriented development, particularly in the data and modeling layers. And this coincided very well with things like the rise of Hibernate, and at the time, early versions of Spring Framework, and even .NET went in that space as well, that allowed for and basically going back to the roots of object-oriented development and being able to create these rich domains. And that's what really, it was a revival of this concept, rebranding of this fairly old concept in terms of domain-driven design, or DDD. Now, I came into DDD actually in the Java EE5 and Java EE6 timeframe. That's when I began to adopt DDD. And I saw that it wasn't being implemented outside of Java EE at the time. But what I also observed is that in my particular projects, I could very easily implement DDD concepts. It was not very difficult because by that time, Java EE actually had modernized to the extent that it actually fit the domain-driven philosophy very, very well, as opposed to J2EE of the yesteryear. So that's actually how I wound up creating this project, now called Eclipse Cargo Tracker, after maybe so many years. Of course, the transition from J2EE to Java EE to Jakarta EE, and now it's a Jakarta EE, official Jakarta EE umbrella project, actually, Eclipse Cargo Tracker. And basically, my objective of this project was to bring forward the idea that you can implement domain-driven design using Jakarta EE and at the time Java EE very, very well. And so, in a way, Cargo Tracker sort of completes the cycle, right? It brings things back to the Java EE or Jakarta EE ecosystem and showing, hey, we can also move forward and adopt this very effective design paradigm that goes to the root of object orientation called domain-driven design. So that's actually what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to give you a Cliff's Notes version, an introduction of that project that I have. Now, interestingly, when I begin to deliver this talk, one observation that I have is, although domain-driven design is almost 10 years old now and actually relatively well established, a lot of people actually don't either have only heard of domain-driven design and have not yet implemented it themselves, or they've actually not heard of domain-driven design at all. Okay. So this makes it a little bit difficult for me in terms of delivering this talk, and that's why I offer you as the audience a choice. Okay. So there's a couple of different ways that I can spend the rest of our 45 minutes or so together with a different type of focus, one way or the other. So I can either focus a little bit on actually explaining domain-driven design in practical terms a little bit, okay, and then focus a little bit on the Cargo Tracker project and how it applies to Jakarta EE, or I can very briefly go over domain-driven design, not spend much time on it, and actually spend more time on the Cargo Tracker project and showing you and talking about how domain-driven design is implemented using Jakarta EE. Right? So there's two different options of how I can deliver this talk, and this is where I need you to think about it a little bit and tell me what you want, and I will adapt the talk accordingly. So, if you would prefer I spend a little bit more time on domain-driven design, please type in DDD. If you prefer I don't spend that much time on domain-driven design and actually spend more time on explaining how domain-driven design applies to Jakarta EE, I kindly request that you type in Jakarta EE. So I'm just going to take about 30 seconds, okay, and I'm going to see what you guys actually want, right? And then I'm going to deliver this talk, tailored to you, tailored to what it is that you want, as my audience today. So I'm going to just exit out of my presentation for a moment. I'm going to pay attention to the comments, and I need some input from you. What do you prefer? Do you want me to explain DDD more, or do you want me to explain DDD as it applies to Jakarta a little bit more. So I'm watching the comments. Please do vote and tell me what you prefer.
Ok, chicos, a ver si prefieren más que Reza se oriente a DDD o prefieren que más oriente su presentación a la aplicación de DDD aplicado a Jakarta. A ver si alguien puede dejar algún comentario que pueden comentar. Yo también cuento, creo, en la opinión. A ver, mientras a mí en lo particular, Reza, I would like to go for the second choice. So the one that you said, how to apply DDD to Jakarta EE.
Okay. Any other opinion other than that one?
Yes, I would like to listen to someone else. A ver, si alguien puede comentar algo adicional. A ver, voy a escribir por aquí.
Okay, anybody else have an opinion, a different opinion, same opinion? If not, we're going to move forward with focusing more on Jakarta E.
I think that we go with this choice, Reza.
Okay, sounds good. Let's do it. All right, so let me move back to my presentation. All right, so I'm going to very briefly go over DDD. Okay, no more than five or 10 minutes, and then we'll focus more on the application and focus more on Jakarta E. So, like any particular design philosophy, primarily, basically the basic objective here is to make your application model the real world. But the way this is implemented is no different than any other, on the design paradigm. Fundamentally, there's a set of design catalogs, and each of them have specific patterns, and it's really just a matter of identifying those patterns and applying them in your system. That's really fundamentally what you are doing. So, what nice thing about DDD is I don't have to invent any of that. It's already out there. This is a particular diagram that actually explains the basic building blocks of DDD. I'll go through them very quickly one by one. So first is entities. Entities are basically objects. A majority of things that in your application, the entity is going to be the most important thing. So entities are objects. They have data. They also have behavior. We'll see that in a moment in the example. But entities also have ID. Right? They have a unique identifier. Roughly, it corresponds to basically a row in a table with a primary key. The next thing that you need to understand in terms of DDD is something called value objects. Value objects are very similar to entities. Again, they're objects, and they have data and behavior. The only difference between entities and value objects is value objects do not have an ID. Typically, value objects will be embedded within entities, and that's how they get their ID. Next is aggregates. What you see in terms of when you begin to model these objects in the real world is that there's clusters of objects and entities that are more closely interrelated to each other. So if you create a big graph, you will see that certain parts of your graph have clusters. And within those clusters, there's a particular entity that is actually more important, typically. And those clusters are called aggregates. And the most, if you will, the most important entity in those clusters is typically called an aggregate root. Again, we'll see an example of this in a moment. Next is repositories, and this is very similar to the DIO pattern. The only difference is in the DIO pattern, typically you're implementing a DIO per table. You're not going to be doing that here. Typically, what you will have in repositories is actually a repository per aggregate root. So typically, there's less repositories than there are data access objects. And as you can imagine, the primary purpose of a repository is to simply abstract data access code. That's about it. Next is factories, and they're very similar to the Gang of Four factories. The reason for the creation of this is actually some aggregate roots are very complex to create. It's not simply just invoking a new operator and doing some setters. There's usually some business logic associated with the creation of an aggregate root. This is the reason why you need to make use of the factory pattern here, and this is why it's specifically recognized in DDD. Next is services. So when I say services, people get a little bit confused because they immediately think RESTful services, but this is not it. There is a place for RESTful services, and we will talk about that in a moment. That has more to do with architecture layers. Over here, services are verbs. Okay, so in every single domain in real life, there's actually not just nouns or objects, but there's actually verbs that are very, very important. So in terms of transportation, one of the important thing is logistics. In terms of hospital management, things like checking in into the hospital is an important thing. In terms of credit evaluation, things like underwriting. Underwriting is a very important thing. So these are verbs, right? So there's nouns and then there's verbs. Typically, these things will not really have data. They'll only really have behavior. And what they do is they act upon. They have non-trivial business logic that acts upon entities and value objects, but because they are so important, they have to be modeled by themselves. Although they do not have an ID, they're not really nouns. So, for example, a noun in an insurance-based system would be an insurer or a policy, but underwriting would be a service that actually acts upon things like insurance policies and insurance holders. Okay, so that's what a service is, and we'll see an example of a service in a moment. Next thing you need to understand is architectural layers. There's other concepts in DDD that I won't talk about. I'll just skip over very, very quickly. Those are things like model-driven design and smart UI. Model-driven design basically means that you don't just blindly create systems. You have to have the real-world object, the real-world model in mind. And also, a smart UI means that your UI should reflect your real-world concerns. So it shouldn't be just a random, looks like you're manipulating a database table. That's not how a UI is supposed to look like. A UI is supposed to be intuitive for the end user. But the thing that we need to talk a little bit more in terms of Jakarta is layered architectures. All right. So you can or cannot have layered architectures in domain-driven design, but in a typical enterprise system, you actually should introduce layers. If you don't do that, what happens is your entities become very, very polluted. Right. So the entities will have data concerns, business layer concerns, UI concerns, infrastructure concerns, all baked into them. I've seen systems like that. Even though they're implementing domain-driven design, ultimately it winds up in an unmaintainable system because you open up these entities, and they're what I would call Uber entities. Like there's thousands of lines long sometimes, each of these entities. The reason this happens is because of lack of separation of concerns. So this is why DDD on its own, in my opinion, in server-side systems is not good enough. You also need to apply separation of concerns. And this is also well understood, and it's sort of part of the DDD community as well. The DDD community understands this concept. So the typical separation of concerns is interfaces. So interfaces is anything in the system that talks to some other external entity or other external thing or system. So typically in the interface layer, it would be your UI that goes in here, your UI logic, and the UI logic will actually typically implement its own design patterns. MVC is a popular one. Another one is things like your RESTful services, right? So your RESTful services will implement REST paradigm as an architecture, but this actually belongs in the interface layer. It's its own thing. Similarly, if you have batch processes, these also are things that belong in the interface layer. Next is the application layer. The application layer actually sits above, as you can see, the domain layer. And what they do is that they model primary use cases in the application, right? So they're a convenient entry point to your application because they basically model the key features of what your application actually does. An application layer actually coordinates over the domain layer. So the domain layer is all the things that we talked about. Things like entities, value objects, repositories, those all belong in the domain layer. And finally, there's infrastructure concerns. Okay, so aside from having an interface, having business logic, having your domain model, often we're actually dealing with infrastructure level concerns. So what are these? These are things like asynchronous processing, security, transaction handling, all of these kind of things. Okay, so logging is another infrastructure concern. So you do need a place for all of these things. And the way you can do that is by segmenting these particular concerns into their own layer called the infrastructure layer. And the infrastructure layer can actually be consumed by any part of any other part of the layers. And often in terms of Java EE, infrastructure is actually declarative. So you don't actually write infrastructure code very much because a lot of that is provided by the platform. So for security, the roles allowed annotation. For asynchronous processing, the asynchronous annotation. For things like scheduling, the scheduled annotation. Things like transactions, the transactional annotations, or EJB transactions. So they're all declarative, but they're also technically part of the infrastructure layer. So another thing you'll notice is that each of these requires are not mandatory. Okay, so if you notice the arrows in this diagram, you will see that in certain cases, like for example, if you do not need an application layer, you can make a direct invocation to the domain layer if you so wish, right? So layers are optional. Right? You apply them when there's value, and you don't use them if there's no value. Okay, so let's begin to talk about how does Jakarta EE, how does these DDD concepts actually apply to Jakarta EE? Right? I told you this is where we'll be spending most of our time today, and I'll talk about this conceptually, but then I'll show you in code, how these concepts actually apply to code. So I've already given you some hints as to how this mapping actually works, but let's talk about more specifically, what do I mean by this? So first and foremost, let's talk about the interface layer. So the interface layer, the Jakarta EE APIs that help you implement the interface layer are things like faces, and faces actually forces you to implement the MVC pattern because faces itself is actually built upon, is an opinionated implementation of the MVC pattern. But anything that you would do in terms of your faces code or even your backing beans, those are helping you implement the interface layer of DDD. Similarly, RESTful services, right? So if you're modeling RESTful services, you will be using the Jakarta REST API to do that. And again, this is helping you implement an object in the interface layer. Same thing for things like WebSocket. Now there's a new technology coming into Jakarta EE, gRPC. gRPC or RPC will belong here as well. Same thing for the Java batch interface. This is also belongs in the batch layer. In this case, you're interacting perhaps with a scheduler or a file system. So again, this is an interface layer concern. So next is the application layer. So as I told you, the application layer models units of work or use cases in the application. And for this reason, enterprise beans or EJB is actually a very good model for this. Because EJBs come built in with the concerns, automatically come built in with the concerns that you would need in this layer. So they're automatically transactional, they're automatically thread safe, they're handling thread safety for you. You can add scheduling there if you want, you can add asynchronous processing there if you want, you can have more fine-grained transaction control if you want, you can add monitoring if you want. So it's a really good place it's a really good mechanism to implement the application layer. You can also do the same thing these days using just a CDI bean. So you can start with a CDI bean and actually add things like transactions or monitoring as you would need it. Going forward in Jakarta EE, I hope that more services will be available to CDI, so you don't have to use EJB if you don't want to. You can add declarative annotations on a piecemeal basis to CDI beans to implement your application layer. But for now, I would say your best bet in terms of implementing the application layer is EJB. So entities are relatively straightforward, right? So typically I would say, basically an entity in DDD basically means a JPA entity. Now, some people will debate that, oh, you shouldn't, entities are too much of an infrastructure concern and so on. In practical terms, I think they're one and the same thing. It doesn't really make sense to add more code. In my opinion, you should just treat DDD entities as JPA entities for the most part, right? In fact, I'll talk about this in a moment when we talk about the infrastructure layer and repositories in particular. There are very good technologies out there like Delta Spike Data or Spring Data JPA or upcoming technology in Jakarta called Jakarta Data. They actually allow you to abstract it even further, and it really makes a lot of sense. Even like, for example, Quarkus has Panache. So that in that world, really, it makes sense. It makes it very easy to think about DDD entities as simply JPA entities. Similarly, value objects have a direct analog in JPA as well. For the most part, value objects you will be modeling using the JPA embeddable. They fit really well for that purpose. They allow you to model data. That's what their purpose is. Typically, they're implementing the encapsulation concern of object-oriented development. Again, embeddables are a really good fit for value objects. Next thing is infrastructure. Okay, so infrastructure is actually where a vast majority of Java EE is concerned. Okay, so things like persistence, like the actual persistence layer code, and some people will go as far as saying, well, I'll talk about that in a moment, what the role of the entity manager is. But things like messaging, right? This is helping you implement infrastructure code. Things like REST client, right? Whether you're using microprofile or Jakarta, any kind of REST client technology, that is helping you implement infrastructure. Java Mail, these are all infrastructure concerns. These are not business level concerns. They're helping you interact with the infrastructure in some way or implement an infrastructure level concern in some way. Finally, there's the repositories. Typically, repositories will be implemented using objects that ultimately use the entity manager, and these will typically be CDI beans. This is how it is implemented in the Cargo Tracker project today. Some people argue that entity managers are basically repositories, and there's some validity to that argument. If you have a relatively simple domain model that you don't need to do a lot of domain manipulation and your mapping is relatively clean, you can actually think of just a pure entity manager API as your repository pattern. In some cases, I would say, Panache basically does exactly that. It creates a sort of a high-level abstraction over entity manager, and that is basically your repository. There's not really a separate repository per se. And of course, there's things like Delta Spike Data, upcoming Jakarta Data API, things like Spring Data JPA. They actually abstract the creation of repositories altogether. Literally, your repository object is just an interface that has some annotation appropriately named called repository. This is an implementation of basically what the intent is with DDD repository objects. So I'm going to stop here for a moment. Again, I did a little bit of an overview of domain-driven design really quickly, right? Not in great detail, and I've already now begun to tell you how does these concepts or design patterns, if you will, in domain-driven design actually map to Jakarta EE technology APIs, and what Jakarta EE technologies help you implement these particular design patterns. So I'm going to stop for a moment. I'm just going to stop just for a minute and see if you have any questions. Right? If you have any questions, please post them now, either in the comments or some other way. And I'll take a little bit of time to answer those questions before we dive into a lot of the code and before we dive into the application. So let me stop and take any questions, please.
A ver, chicos, si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, pues escribir aquí en el comentario que están viendo, en la sección de comentarios, para podérsela compartir con Reza.
Any questions so far?
I think no questions. There is no question so far.
Okay. Yeah. Let me again remind you: there's no reason to hold back questions. You can ask questions, throughout the session. I don't intend to save up time at the very end, not too much anyway.
Okay.
So feel free to ask me questions as we go along. Okay. All right. Next thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is how all of this maps to microservices in particular. Obviously, microservices is a big topic, and some people think that DDD and microservices do not mesh. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but let me tell you, yes, it does. Right. So, in fact, DDD had the understanding of modular-based systems, not necessarily microservices, but modular-based systems for a long time now. It's a concept called bounded context. Okay, so it's a recognition of the fact that systems are typically broken down in modules, okay, or subsystems more specifically. And each of those subsystems model the same domain in a slightly different way. And that's what's called a bounded context. And actually, this goes into, in DDD theory, there's a lot of details around this. So if you want to implement microservices, or at least you want to begin to think along the lines of microservices, DDD actually has very good answers for you in terms of how you model your systems and your domain using bounded context. So I encourage you to take a look at that. There's some example of that in the project itself. I'll show you an example of it. Okay, but DDD and microservices are good friends. All right. So now let's talk about Cargo Tracker as a project. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is actually a project under the EE4J umbrella, the Eclipse Foundation EE4J umbrella. So it's officially a Jakarta EE umbrella project. This is how you find it. Right? This is the URL. Let me just give you a brief tour of the website first. Okay, and show you how the website looks like, and then we'll dive into the details of Cargo Tracker in a moment. First thing I'm going to do is show you just a brief demo, not too much of a demo, a little bit of a demo, so that you have an idea of the application, and then we're going to dive into the code and actually see how these DDD concepts actually look like in code. All right, so let's get started. Here's the website. This is an overview. I basically give you a small version of what the overview is, so the history behind all of this, and how we got there. So you can take a look at all that information. There's also things below that will explain the same thing. Right? So you can take a look at all of these things in greater detail if you want. There is then the getting started, and the getting started can be very, very simple. All you really need to get started with the code actually is just download the code and just run just one command, ambient clean package. This is a Maven-based project, so you can open it up in Eclipse or some other Maven-capable IDE. Okay, we used Eclipse as an example, but you can use IntelliJ or VS Code. It's the same thing. I've used the project with both IDEs, and that's how you can run the project and begin exploring the code yourself. Currently, the project is running on Jakarta E8, Pyara 5, and Java SE8, SE11, or SE18. I'm working to upgrade the project to Jakarta E10. Now that Jakarta E10 is out and Pyara 6 is out, I was waiting for Pyara 6 to be released to do that. So very soon, I'll be upgrading the project to Jakarta E10. But for now, it's Jakarta E8. Okay. And actually, I'm going to show you the demo in Eclipse, but actually, you don't need to use the Eclipse. You don't even need to use the IDE if you don't want to. Okay, so because I've actually deployed this entire application to the cloud, so there's a continuous cloud deployment that gets refreshed every night. Right, so you can actually use that demo application. Thanks to Jelastic and Scaleforce for doing that. Those are our hosts. So again, a little bit more of the background of how we got here. Okay. So these are all of the different things that we actually still use. DTO is another one. that I did that I forgot to mention that originated in the Jakarta blueprints, but is still alive today. Then we talk about how does Jakarta map to DDD. Again, I talked about it a little bit about this with you already. And then finally, at the very bottom of the project, there's also a list of the Jakarta features that we use. It's not a Jakarta project, by the way, right? But our goal is not like to show you every single Jakarta thing that's out there, but it does do that. Right? It's a decent demo project to demo Jakarta features. There's also documentation, right? There's more detailed documentation on how to get started. There's actually a video that will take you through in more detail of what the project does, and I will have time today to do. There's Eclipse IDE instructions. There's mapping. There's more details on how Jakarta maps to DDD. There's even more details of how each of the design patterns are implemented in Jakarta. I'll be showing you a little bit of that in the subsequent 20 minutes or so that I have. There's also a discussion of the layers, okay, and what layers are implemented in the application. There's a description of that. And finally, there's the resources that I'll also share with you. So all of this is available on the website already. So you can definitely take a look at all of that. Okay. Now let's take a quick look at the demo. This is the application. There's three parts of it. The first part is, so what this does is that it tracks cargo on ships going across the world. Well, we had to pick for the application something a little bit complex enough, okay, so that you can actually see DDD in action. In very simple projects, it's difficult to show the value of DDD, but in a more complex project, you can see why DDD is important. So there's three different parts of the application. One is a public tracking interface. So what this does for you is that you can enter a tracking ID and see where cargo has went. Okay, so you can see that this particular cargo was received in Hong Kong. Okay, so it was received in Hong Kong. That's the origin. It was loaded onto a voyage in Hong Kong, and it was offloaded in New York. Okay, so the last known location is New York, and its ultimate destination is Helsinki. Okay, and it will tell you what the next expected activity is. The next activity is to load it onto another voyage from Port New York. Similarly, there is a administrative interface, and this gives you a view of what is going on in all of the cargos. So there's three different types of cargos. One that has been routed, okay, so it's en route. There's also not routed cargo that's not been routed yet, and also claimed cargo. And you can see details of each of those things. It will tell you, hey, this was the itinerary. Right? So if you look at the ABC 123, it'll tell you, what its itinerary actually looks like. There's other functionality, so you can book a cargo. So let's go ahead and book one. So let's say it starts in Melbourne, and let's say we want to go from Melbourne to Rotterdam or Gothenburg in Sweden. And let's say we want this to arrive by December 23rd, and that's 27 days. It's a 27-day journey. So let's book the cargo. When you book it, it'll show up as a not routed cargo, and then we can go ahead and route it now. Okay, and you can see there's three different ways that we could go, three different plans that we could use. So I'll just pick the second one. And this becomes a committed itinerary. So if I go back to the dashboard, this is the one I created, and this is the itinerary that I have. If you go back to the dashboard, there's other things I can do. For example, I can change destination if something is not routed. I can say I can go in a different place, or I can change the deadline. There's also a live map of all the cargo, and it looks like I have some kind of error. Let me refresh.
We have a question, Reza.
Okay. Let me see what's going on. I'm not really, there's always some kind of issue. Let me see if I can use a different browser. This may be a browser specification. I need to look into it. Look into what exactly is going on. My apologies, I won't be able to demo that part. There's also, if you go back, there's also a mobile interface that allows you to enter cargo. Right? So you can say, okay, for a given cargo, let's say the one that is sitting in New York, I want to load it. I believe it was 00T. Okay, and I'm loading it now. I hit submit. And if I go and look at it now, it'll say that ABC123 is onboard cargo. It's boarded already. And if I try to track it here, okay, it's going to say it's going to be offloaded. Right, so it's still on track, right? Onboard voyage, and it's on its next destination is going to Dallas. Yes, I'll take the question.
Okay. Gerard have a question. Can you see or?
Yes. How can I use domain-driven design with test-driven development with Jakarta? So, yes, you can absolutely use domain-driven design with test-driven development. In fact, we have an example of this in the cargo ticket project. So if you go into, for example, source test, okay, you'll see that there's actually a number of tests. So per layer of your application, per architecture layer, there's actually tests for each thing. Typically, you probably want to focus more on unit and integration testing, but yeah, you can absolutely use test-driven development with domain-driven design, no problem. And with Jakarta, there's many different testing frameworks that is available. The one that we use is actually one that's been out there for a little while, Arcadian. It works well with PyRS 6. So we're able to do not just integration testing, but unit testing as well. Okay, so let's go back for a moment and let's begin to take a look at the code. Okay, so here's the code. Yeah, actually, I don't need to open up the IDE for even the code. In fact, let me shut down the IDE. There's no reason we need to use the IDE today. So if you go into the source, let's first begin to take a look at the architecture layers. So as you can see, there's two different. This is actually microservices right here. So Pathfinder is actually a microservice. I think Cargo Ticker you can say is a modular monolith. So these are two different actually bonded contexts right here, implemented using domain-driven design. These are the basic layers that we have. So you can implement it in terms of packaging. So this is why DDD is very good also for modular monoliths. Right? So you can already see some modularization going on here. Right? So it's modulation by package. So there's the application layer, the domain layer, the application layer, and the interface layer. I think we can get started with the application layer. So in the application layer, you will see, for example, booking service. And this corresponds to basically the main UI that you are seeing. Okay, so you can see that, actually, let's go back and let's take a look at, booking service is a decent one. Let's take a look at that. So let me increase the font size a little bit, so hopefully you can see it well enough. Okay, so here's the booking service. It's allowing you to book the new cargo just like we did. It's allowing you to request routes for a given cargo just like we did. We are able to assign our cargo to a route and able to change destination, able to change deadline. Notice that this is basically the high-level use cases in the application. This is literally what it is doing. Then you can take a look at the implementation of this application object. So this is basically default booking service. You will notice that it is a stateless EJD, okay, and it utilizes basically under the hood the domain objects. So there's a cargo repository, location repository, routing service. And really, if you look at, for example, book new cargo, what we do is we interact with the repository layer, get the objects that we want, and simply act as a coordination layer. So this is really the purpose of more or less the purpose of the application layer. It coordinates across your lower level APIs. Primarily has to do with the PDD or domain layer. Okay, so these are all domain layer interactions, but no business logic. All we're really doing here is coordination. So similarly, after we look at the application layer, we can begin to take a look at the domain layer. So in the domain layer, you will see that if you go, there's different types of modules of what the domain consists of. There are services, and there's one important service, and that is called routing service. Okay, and it does this is the one thing. There's no data associated with it. It simply does one action, and that is given a route specification, origin, destination, and deadline. Give me what the options are. That's really all it does. And that's a service in our application. So if you look at similarly at our models, so this is the aggregates. So we have a cargo aggregate, a voyage aggregate, a location aggregate, and a handling aggregate. If you look in the cargo aggregate root, as you can imagine from the name, is cargo. So if you look at the cargo object, it is an entity. Okay, it is a JPA entity and a domain-driven design entity. Now, if you look at its implementation, it has data, things like tracking ID, origin, route specification, itinerary, delivery, and the like. But it also has behavior. Okay, so if you go down here, you'll see this is the getters and setters. But aside from the getters and setters, this is the high-level use cases: specifying a new route, assigning a route to the cargo, driving delivery progress. These are all business logic elements. Typically, you wouldn't see this in an anemic domain model. This is a rich domain model. And actually, ultimately, it is using embeddable objects. So, for example, delivery is a very important part of the cargo aggregate. Here's the delivery object. It actually contains quite a bit of business logic. Okay, so it determines things like, given what is the current status of a cargo, given if you assign a new delivery object, okay, and given a particular state change in the application, it will calculate what is the current status, what is the routing status, what is the transport status, what is the last known location. So this is all, in fact, business logic, okay, embedded within the domain, not the application layer, but the domain. Similarly, we can take a look at some examples of the interfaces. So there's many different types of interfaces for this application. There's a booking interface that's in JSF. There's a handling interface. That is a REST-based interface there. So we're going to that. So there's actually two different interfaces. There's a mobile, REST, and file. So if you look at the REST interface, this is actually a RESTful service. And this RESTful service ultimately simply gets a handle to an application events and just issues application event objects. That's all it does. It delegates down to another layer, primarily part of the application layer. But it simply is concerned with serializing and deserializing data and mapping a RESTful object to an event in the database. Yes, there's a question.
No questions. Sorry for the interruption.
Sure.
Can we finish some minutes before 3 p.m.?
Yes, of course.
To the next session.
We can. Okay. So there's also similarly the infrastructure layer concerns. One of the key ones here would be logging. Right? So we actually use a logging producer to produce loggers. So you can. This is a very high-level overview of what the application does. You can take a look at the rest of it, of course, yourself. And finally, I'll finish up the session about 5 minutes early. I'll give you my contact details, and also I'll show you how to get to my contact details. I don't think you'll have access to the chat. But these are the resources. Of course, there's the project itself. There's also a good free resources on learning more about domain-driven design. And of course, there is resources in learning more about Jakarta. So those are all of those resources. They're also listed on the website. Very quickly, I'll show you how to get to the slide deck. So the slide deck is available on SpeakerDeck, speakerdeck.com/Reza Rahman. And here is the slide deck available to you. And if you want to contact me later on, you can simply go onto my website and hit the contact button. Okay, all of my information is here, including my email address. Anything that you need, you can ask me later on if you can't think of it right now. So that's about it. That's all the time I have right at this moment. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Reza, for your great presentation. I shared both links, the cargo track link and the last one that you share, so the audience can access the information that you have shared during the presentation. Thank you so much. So if someone else have a question, this is the time to ask a question. Okay. I think there is no more questions. Thank you, Reza, for your time and great presentation. And nice to meet you too.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, my pleasure. See you guys soon.
Bye.